The Ministry of Education are very much under the microscope in terms of how they have been managing the risk of asbestos-containing materials within the schools, and also some of the main contractors and subtrades across the country in regards to the management of asbestos-containing materials. Reading these stories, it really takes me back some 10 plus years ago during the Canterbury rebuild. In the early days, I can think off the top of my head of at least half a dozen occasions where I was walking into residential properties. The dust was everywhere. Lava and plaster was being ripped off walls and ceilings. Stippled ceilings were being, smashed apart with sledgehammers. No one really knew much about asbestos, and I'll put my hand up. In the early days, I wasn't particularly that over the top of it either. And it wasn't until the recovery program really kicked into gear, and we started seeing really amazing initiatives from industry and from unions and from government. It got us into workshops and really enabled us to, as a whole, to really appreciate and understand what the risk of asbestos-containing materials was, what they looked like, what to look out for, and how to manage them effectively. It wasn't really until that took place that we were all blindly just kind of cracking into it. And this feels like 10 years later, we're still there. We're still seeing the same mistakes being made at scale within the Ministry of Education, which is just frightening, right? So what I wanted to do is share the story. But I also wanted to just share maybe my top four things to consider when it comes to the management of asbestos-containing materials in the construction environment. So the first one is surveys, ensuring that the surveys before the project kicks off are adequate and are done effectively. Often what happens with surveys, and in particular with the Ministry of Education surveys that take place prior to deconstruction and demolition, is that they take place whilst the school is still live, meaning school kids are in the classrooms, which makes it very, very difficult for anyone to conduct a survey to identify suspected asbestos-containing materials. Often it requires actually the removal and strip down of a few layers before you can actually get to what could be deemed as asbestos-containing materials. Obviously, in the school, the nature is that the projects will most likely take place when the schools are in holiday season. So these surveys have to be taken weeks, months in advance, often when schools are live. So it's possibly one of the biggest problems and instigators that has led to these occurrences of asbestos being disturbed and contaminating classrooms and school environments. The surveys in general are non-destructive in nature. So even outside of school environments, the surveys that take place across the country generally aren't as destructive as they really ideally ought to be. For obvious reasons, right? People don't generally like people putting holes in walls or ripping up carpets or lino to try and find that asbestos. But as a result, what we need to do is need to increase our awareness and risk assessment of the types of buildings and the types of materials that people will likely be engaged to deal with. By doing so, it means that we're then more likely to have appropriate management plans and emergency response plans, which I'll talk about in a minute. That leads quite neatly to the third point, which is around training. So I think back to the training that we received during the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery. By the end of it, I was actually pretty sick to death of the asbestos awareness training. But now, in hindsight, it's served me really well. It's enabled me to have some confidence that when I'm looking at deconstruction and demolition sites, that I've got enough knowledge and awareness to be looking for the types of surfaces, the types of materials, the types of environments, and the likely types of asbestos materials that could be there. I suspect, as years have gone on, and in other regions, this awareness here in Canterbury is probably diminished, and across the nation, there wasn't the earthquake recovery program. So I'm guessing we're probably still back in those days where many people don't even know what asbestos-containing materials can look like, which is quite frightening. And I think there's actually a really big piece of work there that needs to be done by industry, whether it's construction, demolition, deconstruction, civil, whomever. I think we need to take a pause and remind ourselves of actually what asbestos is, what types of materials it's likely to be contained in, the fact that buildings pre-1990 should be considered to have asbestos in them, because pretty much they will do. And yeah, it's getting right back to the basics, because I think we've missed the beat here, and these stories are quite telling. It's quite frightening. Then the last thing, number 4, that I wanted to talk about was the emergency response plans. So back in the day, during the earthquake recovery program, I remember creating hundreds of site-specific safety plans for the residential construction company that I used to work for, and in each of those there was a suspected discovery of asbestos-containing materials response plan. So an emergency plan, just like we have an emergency response plan for fire and evacuation. We had a one-pager emergency response plan if we had torn back a wall and discovered suspected asbestos-containing materials. Reading through the news reports on RNZ, it's just screamingly obvious that there was no plan, or certainly no mention of a plan of what to do upon discovery of suspected asbestos-containing materials. There was a number of occasions, I can think of 2, maybe 3 occasions during my time at the Canterbury Recovery Program, where I had to provide oversight of 3 suspected asbestos-containing materials responses, where I've got the phone call and it's like, we think we've ripped into some lab and plaster, it wasn't checked, what do we do? And so that needs to be planned and needs to be taken care of. I don't have the time, unfortunately, to kind of spell out exactly what the response plan ought to look like, but you can be rest assured that anyone in that immediate vicinity can kiss goodbye to the clothes that they were wearing at that time. Yeah, seriously, it is as far out as that. So those are my 4 top tips. So those are my 4 kind of key takeaways from reading the articles. I'd strongly recommend taking the time to have a look at the RNZ articles. There's about 3 or 4 that have been released over the last week, highlighting the concerns and the issues and the events that have been taking place at the Ministry of Education. Yeah, quite frightening, quite alarming. If you're not fully aware of what asbestos-containing materials looks like, certainly jump onto the WorkSafe website, have a bit of a gander around there, and I'm sure there'll be some useful tidbits and some links in the comment section from others who I know within this group are complete gurus when it comes to asbestos-containing materials.